War and terrorism.
From the early 1960s, war and terrorism in America was seen as a more conservative action.
The United States' involvement in the Vietnam War was seen as a more conservative action because they wanted to contain communism, and it was pushing for a new change in America.
Protests on numerous college campuses, like Kent State University, which occurred on May 7, 1970, and the uprising of the counterculture movement in the mid-60s to 70s, were seen as more liberal because they were anti-war and didn't see a reason why the U.S. was involved in the war. The counterculture was all for peace.
Radical domestic terrorist groups formed during the 70s to promote social change. An example of a domestic terrorist group is the Weather Underground, made up of college students, and they were responsible for the bombings at the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., and the Military Induction Center in Oakland, California. These groups were seen as liberal because they were against war and racism in America.
Another example of domestic terrorism was the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995, done by Timothy McVeigh, a Persian Gulf War Army veteran. McVeigh bombed the Murrah Building because of conflicts between him and the government. The bombing killed at least 168 people and injured more than 680 civilians.
Moving on to more recent examples of terrorism, 9/11 was an international conflict which declared war and terrorism. Shortly after the devastating attack at the World Trade Center, President Bush declared war on Afghanistan.
Moving on to more recent examples of domestic terrorism are school shootings, such as Santa Fe High School in Texas, where 10 people were killed, and Parkland High School in Florida, where 17 people were killed. Mass shootings in churches and mosques, like the Charleston Church in South Carolina, First Baptist Church in Sutherland Spring, Texas, and an Islamic mosque in Bloomington, Minnesota. These events are considered acts of terrorism because it was violence against a mass of people.
War and terrorism still occurs today.
During this time, African Americans won many battles. Boycotts and civil disobedience led to victories across the country for African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 guaranteed African Americans the right to vote despite obstacles at the state or local level. And the Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in housing. The Civil Rights Movement didn't stop with African Americans. Mexican Americans and Native Americans had also begun to vocalize their concerns over unfair treatment. The United Farm Workers of America, more commonly known as the UFW, rose up in a time of civil rights. During the 60s, Cesar Chavez rose up as a historic figure. Chavez began the UFW and fought for increased pay for farm workers. Through boycotting grapes, one of the best-known boycotts that he led, Chavez was able to come to an agreement with the farm owners after a long 5 years. This moment created hope and faith in Mexican-American farm workers around the country that they didn't have to live off little to nothing. Native Americans had also begun to fight for their rights that had been taken by the U.S. government. The American Indian movement, known as AIM, began in the late 60s, originally meant to, and I quote, address issues of extensive police brutality, from the aimmovement.org. The movement grew to encompass a variety of sit-ins and marches. One march included the Trail of Broken Tears, in which Native Americans marched on D.C. and ended up occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs. AIM also occupied places such as Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee to make statements about the sacred lands and lives colonizers took from them. We have progressed in civil rights many ways. President Carter appointed Andrew Young, an African American, as U.S. Ambassador in 1977. Cesar Chavez was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1995, 1 year after his death. Although there were trials held for the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973 on charges against the U.S. government, the charges were dropped and considered misconduct, which was very unfair. Movements today still includes those such as the UFW, but the Black Lives Matter movement has taken over the media and the minds of the country. A movement begun by a black child fatally shot by a police officer for wearing his hood, the Black Lives Matter movement shows that although we have progressed in civil rights, we have yet to achieve ultimate equality.
The topic I chose was the women's rights movement. The 1960s and 70s ushered in big changes for women in America. From family life to the workplace to reproductive rights, there was a charge for change known as the women's rights movement. But long before then came the fight for women's suffrage, which granted American women the right to vote in 1919. The movement, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, paved the way for the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. In 1960s, family planning was transformed as the FDA-approved birth control pills for contraceptive use opened a new chapter for the career woman. About 3 years later, at the urging of Esther Peterson, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act. Also that year, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which documented what she saw as the oppression of middle-class women. By the 1970s, women of all ages, races, and backgrounds had joined in the fight for equality. Gloria Steinem campaigned for a constitutional amendment to guarantee equal rights for women, and in 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Though the amendment was never ratified, the following year, the Supreme Court would make a decision that would have a profound effect on the lives of American women. In a landmark case, Roe v. Wade, the High Court ruled that a woman has a constitutional right to choose to have an abortion. Abortion services were made safer and more accessible to women after the ruling, which would face repeated challenges in later years. Although Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, the fight over abortion rights and woman equality continues to this day in the U.S. and around the world. The women's rights movement is liberal because we are willing to discard traditional values of women being discriminated in the nation.